Hello, Internet. My name is Zemos HD, and welcome. Today I'm going to be talking about the far right, racism, race realism, and all that jazz. It's really important to understand and how to pick apart arguments, but more importantly, how to spot when someone is blatantly lying to you. We'll use this egregious example, this video by intellectual Embargo, as a perfect demonstration.
So we all know that race is real, but how do we make that argument to others so they can understand race better? Well, I think like all arguments, the better you can understand the person you're talking to, the better you can focus on things that make sense to them, are relevant to them, right? If you wanted to explain gravity to someone who doesn't have a good grasp of the concept of mass, right? That's different than explaining gravity to someone who does understand mass, right? So what positions might someone hold on the reality of race, right? I'd say there's three major positions, right? One, race is not real in any sense. That's one position. They say that, hey, all humans on the inside are totally identical. Our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions are identical. They might say that race is only skin color and nothing else. Now, some of these people like this hold this position basically for religious reasons. They believe that the conscious mind is a soul, and they worship a universalist God who gives everyone the same soul, right? That kind of thing. Now, they might say that race doesn't matter at all, but culture totally does, because culture is something that the soul does, or the soul is accustomed to. Race is just totally superficial. Not a ton of people hold this position super hard, but definitely some do. The second position is the opposite position. It's our position for the most part. Race exists. It's a matter of genetic lineage. It's a matter of divergent human evolution over long periods of time. Tibetans have genetic differences due to their thousands of years of a high altitude that changes the way that oxygen binds to their blood. Europeans and Middle Easterners frequently continue to produce lactase, which is an enzyme, our whole lives, while most other humans stop producing it sometime after childhood, right? It's what allows us to drink milk. It has to do with our history of domesticating animals, right? And we understand, for example, that evolution doesn't only work from the neck down. It affects the brain.
Okay, so this is a conflation that he's going to make a lot in the video, and this is something that is conflated a lot with race realism in general, but there's a fundamental difference between adaptation and evolution. For example, the ability to survive and breathe air in thinner air climates, that is an adaptation. The ability to drink and consume milk without any problems, that is an adaptation. However, he takes this as evidence that there are evolutionary, biological, and genetic differences between the races, so distinct that we can separate each other into subgroups. Because this is what race realism is. It's the idea that races represent subspecies of the human population. The problem is that human beings don't have enough genetic variation to actually be considered subspecies. Take this study, for example. They compared the genetic variation between chimpanzees, our closest ancestors, to human beings, and they found that chimpanzees have enough genetic variation to be considered races, to have subspecies, but human beings don't. And I mean, this makes sense because, well, the idea of evolution is that over time, these adaptive differences stack on each other to the point where the DNA cannot be closely aligned to the previous, population. And I mean, this makes sense. Human beings haven't been around that long. And so evolution doesn't really make that much sense when we're talking about human beings. Unless you're talking about our ability to stand upright, then yeah, that's an evolutionary difference between us and our closest cousins in the animal kingdom, like gorillas and chimpanzees.
The third position is race is real insofar as people's actions have caused it to be real, right? All racial differences stem from different life experiences. Your average white Democrat of the United States might say something like, white people being oppressive bigots has created race because, whites have treated different people differently, right? And because whites have caused this different treatment, there's this different life experience, right? Race will continue to exist until we heal the wounds of white supremacy, according to them.
Nice. Notice how he doesn't offer up any rational reasons why a person would not believe in race realism. Like, for example, how I don't believe in race realism because one, the data doesn't point to race realism, two, humans are inherently in tribal, and this is why we've created races in the first place because it's a social construct. We are othering other people in order to protect our in group. This has been noted throughout history. I don't think I should have to provide a source for this, but if you want me to, I'll do it if you ask me in the comments.
Now, your average boomer sort of white Republican will look at the situation down in South Africa where black people are chanting at the EFF political rally about killing white farmers, right? The white boomer will say that race is only real down there because the black majority simply does not want to look past race. They don't want to grow up and be colorblind about race.
White man, you rascal! All of you, you must die like our forefathers. Shoot you again, Epura! White man, you must die like a slave.
Another famous far right tactic is to use the example of South Africa as what would happen if minorities gained a majority status in this country. The only issue is that that's fundamentally ignoring history. You see, not too long ago, back in like what, the 90s, apartheid was finally abolished in South Africa. Apartheid was kind of like segregation, except instead of segregation where it's your own congressmen and leaders oppressing you down, this was another country coming in and oppressing the group, then people from that country staying within South Africa. Those people in the video probably lived under the apartheid government. They probably carry a lot of racial hatred due to the things that they went through. Now, I'm not justifying that racial hatred, obviously, but I'm saying that his implicit well, actually, it's not implicit. It's pretty explicit here. The explicit intention here is to show that black people hate white people as much as white people would hate black people. That there are obvious racial tensions that we get over because we are inherently different, which isn't true. But I mean, hey,
We're trying to convince people who are in position 1 or position 3, and there's a lot of people who sort of vaguely hold small ideas out of both of those positions, right? Some people are totally 3, some people are totally 1, but you'll also see, and you'll sometimes see that they'll hold a contradictory position out of both camps. They'll say like race totally doesn't matter, but at the same time they'll say racial diversity is a good thing and we need to push for diversity. Now, if we're all exactly the same on the inside, pushing for diversity doesn't do much of anything except for just changing the superficial appearance of people, right? If we're really the same, if you had a half black, half Asian group of 10 people, right? 5 Asians, 5 blacks. If we're all the same on the inside, this group is not really different at all from 10 white people, except for just superficial looks. Because at the end of the day, it's just 10 interchangeable souls. So you will see some contradictory positions, and you can.
So, no, that's not how that works. The reason why we want diversity is because, one, we're helping disadvantaged groups, and two, it's because these different groups have different experiences. See, I'm tapping into his, straw man here because it's partly true. But the part that's a straw man is the fact that this is the only reason why people believe that race isn't real. And that, the idea is that certain groups experience certain things, and that's what makes race. That's only partly true. The other part is the fact that we have social constructs that make us believe that these things are fundamentally different, as I explained earlier.
Point out contradictions, but, largely people can be placed in a camp. First, you want to figure out what the person you're talking to actually thinks. If it's a matter of faith, if it's a religious argument, you could always come at them with religious arguments, right? You could be like a Christian identitarian. You could say that white people are descended from the ancient Israelites who made a covenant with God. You could, if you're black and the person you're talking to is black, you could make an argument, this exact same argument, that black people are the ancient Israelites, right? Now, keep in mind, these people who claim that they are the chosen people, they are descended from the ancient Israelites, they get labeled as hate groups by the SPLC and the ADL. Because calling your people the chosen people and believing other groups aren't chosen is hateful, unless you're a very specific group who's allowed to do that. Now, if the people...
Yes. A cursory Google search shows that they're willing to actually, call Jewish hate groups hate groups. Nice try, though.
Well, you're talking to have the third worldview, right? They view racial groups as different for various reasons, like being treated differently. Sometimes their views are fairly simple. Sometimes their views are complex. They can be fairly nuanced, right? And on some level, some of these ideas can be correct, at least partially. I mean, clearly they don't have the whole picture, right? If they ignore biology, you can't have the whole picture, but they can have ideas that have some amount of legitimate explanatory value. But to a large degree, normally when people hold a position 3 thing, it's a lot of the times their own sort of personal theory, especially if they're more right-wing. If they're more left-wing, it's maybe more like what they heard from a college course, right? Well, right-wingers tend to have their own, like, I think culture spreads this way, and it's something they've thought of, or it's like some sort of combination of like what their dad said plus what their uncle said plus there's some of their own ideas, you know what I mean? So ultimately, while you can start to formulate some ideas for approaching left-wingers because they tend to have more uniform beliefs, right-wingers, they're kind of all over the place. I can't tell you exactly how to address their specific worldviews, but here's the thing, right? You can often listen to what a position 3 person has to say, left wing or right wing, right? And just see it for what it is. You generally don't even have to argue against it unless you see something that you consider very flawed. Instead of arguing against their ideas about how culture spreads and how that is all happening, right? If you listen to it and, you be fairly respectful as they present their ideas, and once you've respectfully heard their ideas, you can often bring out your own ideas. Once someone feels that they've been listened to, they're often more willing to listen to other people. So you don't have to necessarily disprove their ideas about culture, especially if some of those ideas are good, right? All you do is you present your own factual and compelling ideas about biology. If your ideas make big enough of an impact on them, what they'll do is they'll often synthesize a new worldview that incorporates the biological reality you've exposed them to. They may drop or they may alter, if they need to, some of their old ideas as they bring into your new ideas, right? So, again, you give them a listen, you be respectful, and then you introduce factual and compelling ideas about biology. Now, what sort of things can you talk about with them?
Now we get into the meat and potatoes of the video. Be warned, there's a lot of logical fallacies here. On his part, not mine.
Well, for one, race and IQ, that's a big one. Different groups have different IQs. The research points to huge differences, and it points to genetic components to those differences. Now, one thing you can bring up, sometimes people freak out. They say, oh, well, pointing out that different groups have different IQs is very hateful. It certainly is not hateful, and it certainly doesn't need to be hateful. But you could also point out, for example, that different racial groups tend to be better or worse in specific mental areas, right? Even Wikipedia points out that East Asians do particularly well at visuospatial abilities. Jews do very well on verbal subjects. So even if everyone in the world was exactly 100 IQ, right? If we were all 100 IQ the same, we would still expect that there would be racial differences. There would be racial strengths and racial weaknesses in our mental abilities. This isn't hateful. If everyone in the world was exactly 100 IQ, we might expect that Hollywood, for example, still has a lot of Jewish writers, and engineering firms have a lot of Asian engineers, right? It's not mean, but this is a genetic reality, right? Now, I can't give an entire primer on race and IQ in this video. Suffice it to say, you'll have to look it up, right?
Oh my god, my lungs. Yeah, when you specifically don't cite your sources in your description, I'm gonna say that you're probably just pulling half of this out of your ass. Like you're doing right now. He doesn't even tell us which Wikipedia article he's actually looking at. I found it, and I think he's actually misrepresenting it and that he doctored this. I'm not even joking. The Wikipedia article is on race and intelligence, and as you can see here, the wording of the article is completely different from the screenshot he showed. It's actually disjointed. It's like he took one segment off and put it in another way. Also, I couldn't find that visuospatial part. I'm not sure if he's lying about that or if he just, has a different Wikipedia article, but he didn't cite it. And I think I know why, because in the third paragraph here, you see that they're comparing UK residents to African migrants who have come in and done tests, and they have found that these African migrants often do higher than the national average. I wonder why an immigrant group who's notoriously known for having higher socioeconomic status and college education would be doing so much better in an average UK population. I wonder why. Does it have anything to do with the fact that they have more money or something like that?
If you want to go down that rabbit hole with your friends, honestly, just be as well read as possible. Because the more you know about race and IQ, the more you'll be able to answer objections, the more you'll be able to communicate the points well. It's honestly a really big topic because if you really want to get into race and IQ, you'll learn a lot about just intelligence research in general, as well as genetics. But there are things that are more...
So notice how he didn't cite any evidence that supports his claim that race and IQ are genetic, that these things are different because they're genetic. He just pointed to disparities and said, well, it must be genetics. This is called begging the question. It's when your premises assume that the conclusion is true. He does this a lot in the video, but I want to attack the specific idea that race and IQ are somehow genetically linked. Now, there's really only one study that could really even be seen as good evidence against the idea that environment has a lot to do with IQ differences between the races. And that is, of course, 30 years of cognitive research by these chuckleheads at the Pioneer Fund. These two are notorious for the fact that, they're not only racist, but they're unreliable sources. For example, Jensen, in an interview with the American Renaissance, literally promoted forced sterilization of black people because their IQs were too low for him. That's not a joke, by the way. He literally did that. Or how about the fact that many academics have criticized Rushton's work for leaving out key factors in analysis of his, racial variances in IQ and crime stats and whatnot. Or there's the fact that they're funded by the Pioneer Fund, which is, biased research institution, which typically funds hereditary and race and IQ studies, so that way they can promote eugenics. But you know what, I get it, I understand, you probably think that just calling them racist and biased doesn't really debunk their claims, and I would agree. What does debunk their claims are, researchers who debunk their claims, making two very specific points here. One, that they have insufficient evidence to prove that it's actually genetics that carries these variances in IQ and race, or two, that they flat out ignore factors like environment that would contribute to the IQ gap between the races. But I don't know, that might just be my inner SJW libcuck talking.
Simple to talk about, but I think are very compelling. Just talk about, for example, brain volume, because it's a physical thing that can be observed. It's not abstract at all, right? If someone thinks that there is no biological role to the way we are as people, just give them this physical attribute, right? Do you remember the Neanderthals? One of the things that most people know, I think, many people know at least, is that Neanderthals mostly lived in Europe and white people mixed with them, right, for the most part. The people with the most Neanderthal DNA are Europeans, right? Now, Neanderthals, of all the human variants, right, everything Homo habilis, Homo sapiens, Homo Neanderthal, right, they had the largest brain volumes, right? Some of those Neanderthals had brain volumes in excess of 1,700 cubic centimeters. Very large brains for any sort of human variant. Now, modern white men have something closer to like 1,350 cubic centimeters, much smaller than the Neanderthals we mixed with, right? And with such drastic changes over time in brain volume, because the brain volume for white people has decreased by like 10% over the last 10,000 years, right? We've been experiencing such huge drops in brain volume in white people. Are we really expecting all of humanity to have identical brains? Just ask them that. You know, here we are around the globe, different forces were subject to different selective pressure. Are we expecting everyone to sort of maintain perfectly the exact same brain over time in all these different areas when we're dealing with all sorts of different challenges? Because that doesn't make any sense, right? Our brains have been in influx constantly for millennia. Expecting them to match up over the course of human history is kind of just stupid. Now, someone might suggest that maybe we match up today. You know, historically we haven't matched up, but today is the day. We're all the same inside today. You know, now what the heck would that mean? It would mean that some of us are on our way up and some of us are on our way down, and we just happen to be matching up today. Now, that's an interesting idea, but kind of a goofy one. It means yesterday we didn't match up, and it means, guess what? Tomorrow we won't match up again. I don't know why today would be such a special day. Today is the crossroads, but today won't last forever.
Once again, we have him begging the question. He's literally just saying, hey, look, white people have more Neanderthal DNA than black people. Therefore, their skull sizes would be larger. The only problem with that is that research into Neanderthal skulls have found out that the reason why they've had larger skulls is because they have bigger bodies. And that most of that, larger brain volume has to do with the fact that they needed more processing power to control their bodies, and that they needed more processing power for the fact that they had larger eyes, being able to, see farther distances or whatever. So, that brag about having more Neanderthal DNA doesn't really look as good when you find out that Neanderthals were worse at cognitive processes, does it? We also have the problem of, what is brain volume worth, and how does it affect intelligence? Research shows that it only affects about 2% of your intelligence as a human being, and that makes sense. It's just brain volume. It's not the synapses, it's not the gray matter, it's not whatever. However, I want to take this as, let's say that this was a definitive thing, that, oh yes, of course, brain volume is everything. Well, the problem is that we have environmental factors that not only can change your brain volume, but can change your IQ. For example, lead contamination. We know that black people are more likely to be exposed to lead contamination, whether it be in their housing or their food, whatever. And because of that, that can lead to substantial drops in IQ. Of course, he's never going to actually, engage with this type of research or these controls, because his motive is to just say it's genetics. That's why you find these weird, reductive, non-factual analysis of these highly complex issues.
So if it's only today, then who cares? Now, I like race and brain volume because it's a very straightforward, it's a physical thing, but it's also a mental thing, right? Unless you hold the position that the conscious mind is a soul and not part of the brain, this is pretty clear cut, right? Race and IQ is more abstract, but there's one other abstract thing, one other sort of line of argument that I want to touch on. And this may be more impactful when you're talking to sort of more intelligent people, and that's the heritability of political belief. Ultimately, our idea of what is fair, our idea of what comprises justice, what exactly constitutes a betrayal, right? Those things are measured and categorized in the brain, right? There are physical brain structures that handle our thoughts. Now, some of us, that'll be fairly obvious, right? And while I don't know of any research that looks at those structures directly in terms of showing racial differences and what we consider fair based on the brain structure differences, like morphology, that research might be out there. If it is, go ahead and link it in the comments. But we can look at the results, right? We don't have to see into the box, so to speak, just to see the difference in the results. The heritability of political views. Now, here's a paper you can look at. It's Genetic Influences on Political Ideologies, and it's a twin analysis. And let me quote from this paper. This is just from the discussion section. Quote, "The influence of genetic factors on the development of political ideology appears to be reasonably uniform across time, measure, and country, while the influence of common and unique environmental factors differ with the shifting political and social factors in various circumstances. We thus demonstrate systematic, cross-temporal, cross-cultural genetic influence on the emergence of political ideology." End quote. So we're seeing scientifically that there are maybe environmental factors to what you believe, and that environment is very variable in different times and different locations across the world. But we're also seeing definite genetic influences on why you believe what you believe. And when we take you to a different time, cross-temporal, or different places, cross-cultural, we're seeing those same genetic influences are basically being fairly static, right? They are their own thing. So in the United States, the only group that majority supports free speech is white people, right? And it's obvious that most immigrants do not support free speech. When you import people who don't support free speech and from a genetic group who don't support free speech, you're not just importing one generation of people. You're creating a multi-generational genetic attack on free speech because you're influencing the genetics of the total electorate, right? The electorate over time contains relatively fewer genes that advocate for free speech, and you are introducing more and more genes, more and more genetics of the anti-free speech group, right? Eventually, if you have enough genetic density of these anti-free speech genes, right, free speech dies. White people are the only group who support a small, limited government. White people are the only group that supports gun rights. When you push the country genetically, racially, away from whites, you are pushing away from white politics.
Once again, he's begging the question. He hasn't proven any genetic differences between the races substantial enough to prove that there's subspecies in the human race. And this study doesn't even control for race. But more importantly, I just want to ask, what about Europe? You know that Europe has some of the most strict hate speech laws and gun laws, right? Like, are they genetically closer to blacks and Hispanics? Are you serious? Like, you wouldn't make that argument, would you, Intellectual Embargo? God, that's such a cringy name. But anyways, no, this analysis is so brain dead it's not even funny. I just really love the fact that he's literally just pointing to a disparity and saying it's just genetics. Like, how lazy can you get?
Maybe that's not what you want to hear, but that is what's happening. And that's the entire Democrat plan, right? The Democrats can't get white Americans to vote for them because they hold basically non-white politics and to a large degree anti-white politics. Only young, naive whites will vote for them. So they work to replace white Americans who won't vote for them with non-white Americans, well, non-white now Americans who will vote for them, right? So when Ben Shapiro says, "I don't give a good damn about the so-called browning of America, color doesn't matter, ideology does," right? This is a fundamentally flawed way of thinking because it completely ignores the reality, right? It ignores something that isn't that hard to understand. Our brain and our genetics influence our ideology. Browning of America's population means browning of America's ideology. I understand why people, mostly white people, push to separate ideology from race because it really does appeal to our sense of fairness, right? But it's scientifically invalid. We can't put our heads in the sand about this and expect everything to work out well. There may be, a few people who are mixed, they're mestizos, they're Colombian American, and they think, oh man, the American politics is way better than what I had back in Colombia. Well, that person has to realize our politics are the way they are because of our genetics, right? If they then say, by the way, we should have open immigration from Colombia, well, what's going to happen? They are going to Colombianize America. While libertarians like to parade around some ex-Venezuelan, right? Because that person says, oh, I experienced the horrors of socialism. We should do things the American way. This is way better. And I understand that. I appreciate that. They're a Colombian, or they're a Venezuelan who holds white politics far more than your average Venezuelan. That's what they are. I mean, that's what you're going to have to accept. If they open the borders and we just take in all the Venezuelans and all the Colombians, we will become that. We will become what they came from, because there is a genetic component to this, right?
So, I guess, according to intellectual embargo, all the countries in the world have perfect democracies where everyone gets a fair share of the votes. It's not like someone from North Korea wouldn't vote in a dictator or anything, right? Even though they just escaped the horrors of a dictatorship. It's not like someone who was, formerly in a Southern American country who had just escaped a dictator who brutally deposed a democratically elected leader would vote in someone who's similar to that dictator, right? That's genes that did that, not any sort of kind of other factors besides genetics that got those dictators there, right?
So, in the same way, if you let's say you're not white and you're living in a white country, what you should want is the country to remain white so that the politics remain white politics and you get to enjoy it. In the same way, while I've been around the world, I loved Japan, for example. I wouldn't want to go over there, like if a bunch of white people move there, if they start to influence the politics, if they start to be part of the electorate, Japan will become less like what it is and more like wherever those people came from, right? It's bad. Don't do that. So now the point is, someone can take this scientific understanding that I've talked about, right? They can take the ideas of the heritability of political views. They can take this understanding of brain volume, showing a clear racial difference in our brain, right? And they can simply synthesize it with their own ideas about the spread of culture and how that works. Whether they're a leftist who have gotten their views from on high, or if they're sort of more of a right-winger with their own sort of pet ideas about how culture works. We can bring people to our side, not necessarily by going out and crushing all the beliefs of other people, because some of those beliefs may even be somewhat correct. They have some explanatory value. All we need to really do is present factual and compelling ideas about biology, human biodiversity, and divergent human evolution.
See, that's the funny part. You see, you failed on multiple different levels. Let's look at the first one. You're begging the question most of the time. I'm not sure whether or not you misrepresented that Wikipedia article, but you don't cite any of your sources. And on top of it all, you even admit that you don't even have evidence for your claims. Notice how for every single one of my claims, I can substantiate them. I mean, I have. They're down in the comment section below. I'm even going to post the consensus on racial realism in there. Yeah, because, I know the consensus. He's just wrong. Like, this is not really that big of a debated issue in the scientific community. We figured this out by now. I mean, we literally have studies mapping the human genome. You think they would have said, oh my gosh, we have found the genes that make white people and black people different. I mean, don't you think we would have found that already? Like, I'm pretty sure, I'm not 100% sure, but it'd be like a 95% chance that these types of people are making faith-based arguments. They know they don't have the data to back up what they're saying, and they're just saying, well, we'll find it eventually, or it must exist, and I just can't find it. But yeah, race exists genetically, and it's not true at all. The scientific consensus is pretty clear.